In 1941, Hitler's empire covered Europe from the continent's western corner to the east. Berlin rode a wave of euphoria, while the German army rampaged from victory to victory.
I've always argued that the World War II German army was one of the most remarkable fighting machines that the world has ever seen.
What could stand in the way of the Wehrmacht? How could Hitler's lightning war be extinguished? Perhaps only by the mania of its own creator. In June 1941, Hitler tore up the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, invading by surprise across a 1,000-mile front and attempting to stun Stalin's Soviet lands into submission.
Some of his most important and influential advisors came to him before he invaded Russia, and they said, "Mein Führer, this cannot be done. We do not have the resources." But Hitler just listened and said thank you, and then went and invaded Russia.
Led by a deluded belief that racial superiority and willpower were enough, Hitler took on a vast land and people in their own world of ice and grit.
The Hitler-Stalin conflict is something you cannot really find an analogy for in history.
There, Hitler's soldiers writhed amidst the snowdrifts of Moscow, the ruins of Stalingrad, and the dust clouds of Kursk.
Everything was freezing. The guns were freezing, the clothing was freezing, the men were freezing.
It is absolutely brutal, and many of them are not prepared. Humans seize up. The tools of war seize up.
They were attacking with sharpened spades through sewers. They were attacking out of cellars. It was a savage battle which actually terrified the German soldiers.
Well, it's wrong to talk about the Second World War as if it was a conventional war in which rational military considerations play an important part.
These people only take power in political chaos, and then out of that chaos they build something, and that looks like an achievement at first. They build a monolithic state, and then of course their ambitions don't stop there.
This vast invasion would bring Hitler's Reich crashing down around him, stretching resources, manpower, and his deranged vision to their limits. This is Hitler uncovering his fatal obsession.
It's always been a British conceit to believe that Britain was the foremost enemy of Nazi Germany. In truth, going right back into the 1930s and even 1920s, that Hitler's designs were always in the East. It was always in Russia and the Ukraine that he envisaged the creation of Germany's great empire.
Hitler and a lot of the Nazi ideologues were very keen on this idea of Lebensraum, of room to live, basically, for an expanding German population. The whole idea of this sort of future occupation, this future colonization, involved basically killing by starvation around 30 million Soviet citizens. And this was called the Hunger Plan. They particularly were interested really in the farmland and of keeping enough Russian, Ukrainian farmers and peasants basically to work as helots, as slaves, really for the German Reich.
Hitler thought of the Soviet Union as a vast mass of subhuman peasants lorded over by a small clique of Jewish Bolsheviks. It's an extraordinary view because, of course, Stalin himself was anti-Semitic, and he was not steered by the Jews in any way. How could they possibly do that? In fact, he launched various anti-Semitic campaigns himself. But that was the Nazi view, that was Hitler's view. And so he thought that if you invaded the Soviet Union, you defeated their armies, you kind of decapitated the system, then it would all collapse because the great masses of Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians and others were just simply not capable of running a state themselves. It was a really profound misconception, but that is what he believed. And you can see this emerging many times through the war itself in Hitler's overconfidence in dealings with the Soviet Union.
But in August 1939, the world was stunned by the news that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the
From Moscow on the 22nd anniversary of the Russian Revolution, Stalin's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, served notice that once again Russia was a player in Europe's game of power politics. Loudly he denounced France and England as capitalist instigators of war, branded the U.S. as an unneutral war profiteer. For 6 long years, every Russian worker has been told that Hitler's Germany was the Soviet Union's deadliest and most dangerous enemy. But today, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia are bound by a treaty of non-aggression. A reciprocal trade agreement calls for the delivery to warring Germany of millions of dollars worth of sorely needed raw materials.
The relationship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union from the beginning of Hitler's rise to power is quite a surprising one. And in the background, in fact, they continued economic relations which were quite intense. Solzhenitsyn said that Hitler was probably the only man that Stalin ever trusted. I think that's going too far, but he certainly trusted him more than he trusted anyone else. Maybe a lack of judgment, or it may be a certain admiration. There's definitely a moment when Hitler decided to get rid of his opposition, the night of the Long Knives, when the brown shirts were murdered. As Stalin's reporter was saying, clever man, that's the way of dealing with the opposition. And in fact, his own purge of his opposition, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives, began shortly afterwards. It may not be a coincidence.
Under the dictatorships of Hitler and Stalin, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously invaded Poland in September 1939, marking the beginning of World War II. The country was carved up in just the way that the two invading forces had planned in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By 1940, Hitler had reached Paris, and the Allies were forced to evacuate at Dunkirk. Britain was now under direct attack, and the German war machine had an air of invincibility. With his sights now set on the east, Hitler had his chance to fulfill his ultimate obsession when he launched Operation Barbarossa.
On the practical side, the German armed forces, which in this case of course means the army and the air force, saw little problem with it. This is the sort of campaign they knew for a fact they could execute. This is the sort of campaign what you could say they would have regarded as their bread and butter. This is not the sort of dilemma they found themselves confronted with the previous summer, when essentially confronting the United Kingdom. Most of the senior officers would have known that even if the Luftwaffe had won the Battle of Britain, crossing the Channel would still not have been viable, which was immensely frustrating to these gentlemen. Now all of a sudden all they have to do is cross an international border. And that's the sort of thing they do. They come with a new tool of high-intensity land warfare, the Panzer Division, which essentially is capable of unprecedented feats on the field of battle.
German agents have been working behind the lines inside Russia for some weeks before the invasion. And it was the fact that the Russians had got wind of this, and it had been reported to Stalin, that made it so incredible that Stalin was not only disbelieving himself, but that also he absolutely refused to allow any precautions to be taken in the forward areas.
Hitler had managed to hoodwink Stalin in a very strange way, that Stalin was somebody who was one of the greatest tricksters history has ever known, and yet he fell into this trap of actually believing somehow that the Nazi-Soviet pact was going to work. So when Hitler started sending aircraft over the frontier, Stalin felt that this was part of a negotiating tactic to force the Soviet Union to pay more in the pact. They did not know about these huge preparations. They did know about the concentration of troops. Already you saw all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea, enormous concentrations of troops, in many cases hidden wherever they could be in forests and so forth. But Stalin even believed the story that this was to avoid bombing from Britain, and this is why they'd all been moved to the east.
And thus, when, on the day, the first German units swept across the border, and when they first signaled, some of them, to border guards on the other side to come and talk, And these border guards advanced and of course were mown down, and the Germans then swept on past them. The Russians were taken by surprise even more dramatically than the Americans at Pearl Harbor a few months later, that the Russian forward areas, they'd been explicitly forbidden to take any of the precautions they might have taken if they'd observed all the warnings they'd had, that Marshal Zhukov had urged on Stalin, that Soviet intelligence had urged on Stalin, and Stalin absolutely refused to accept.
He had many warnings indeed, both from the British, from the Americans, but he kept on thinking that this was an English provocation to get him to start fighting the Germans. And they had a very, very difficult time in knowing what to do when suddenly they found themselves under fire. And this was one of the reasons why there was such chaos and such panic on the Soviet side.
Operation Barbarossa would be the largest military campaign in history. The sheer scale of the fighting and the brutality of the warfare proved to be the turning point of World War II. At the start of World War II, the Soviet Union had invaded the eastern half of Poland and occupied the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all as part of an agreement with Nazi Germany. The Soviets had attempted to capture Finland as well, but were met with fierce resistance. But in June 1941, they were now on the defensive, as Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and German forces marched into Soviet-controlled Poland and beyond.
The West never had good agents up in the corridors of power in Nazi Germany in the course of the war. Stalin had fabulous human sources, and these human sources were all the time, for months before the invasion, reporting back to Moscow that this invasion was coming, and yet Stalin absolutely refused to accept a word of it, and thus all his forces in the forward areas, the aircraft all destroyed on the ground, Soviet aircraft, hundreds of Soviet aircraft in the first hours. You had the German pilots who had had to fight for their lives during the campaign in France and all the rest of it, suddenly couldn't believe what they were seeing, that there they are on this first day, flying over Russian airfields where all these Russian aircraft are lined up in rows for them to machine gun and bomb. And the troops, of course, they were simply easy meat for those German divisions that were storming forward.
Well, remember, the Red Army was totally demoralized. Stalin had shot most of his senior generals. He shot his superb Marshal Tukhachevsky, who had had his own philosophy of blitzkrieg, who'd worked out a way of dealing with any German invasion, partly because Stalin was afraid of Napoleon appearing in time of war, and he may be right. The military might have taken over. So the Red Army was demoralized by no senior officers virtually. Most of the people at the rank and colonel above were dead or in the camps and crippled. And then they just lost the war, very humiliating, against Finland. The Great Red Army was nearly defeated by a small group of Finnish skiing soldiers. The Finns did have to make peace in the end, but to lose to a tiny nation like that was such a humiliation that they had no confidence, and it took some considerable time before new figures appeared. Stalin himself seems to have gone into a depression for 3 weeks, not knowing what to do, what to say, even wondering if his colleagues might arrest him.
He was terrified. Here, all his predictions, all his promises, never mind to the Russian people, his promises to his own closest members of the Presidium and all the rest of it, they'd all been proved to be worthless, that Hitler had launched this devastating invasion, that his armies were retreating in chaos with hundreds of thousands of casualties. Stalin thought that those around him were going to do what he would have done in the same place and have him shot. And so we have these few days of quite extraordinary paralysis at the top in Moscow, where Stalin has just gone almost sitting there waiting like a condemned man for his executioners to arrive. He does nothing, he says nothing. There's no public statements, nothing comes out of Moscow. And he is absolutely amazed when so craven was the mood among the leadership of the Soviet Union at this point, so terrorized after all the purges, that he suddenly finds these wretched men coming to their leader who's betrayed them and saying, Comrade Stalin, what should we do? What should we do? They were so accustomed to this absolute mastery by this one man that Stalin suddenly found after a few days that he wasn't going to be a shot, that instead he remained the only man whom everybody turned to make some decisions.
One of Stalin's first moves after reasserting his control was to sign a military alliance with the United Kingdom, the Anglo-Soviet Treaty.
Inside the Kremlin, where the appeasement pact that immediately preceded September 1st, 1939 was signed, there is today another meeting, a sober meeting with the fighting British. Molotov is there, and so is Stalin, whose word is law, and also Sir Stafford Cripps, the British ambassador. Molotov signs for the Union of Soviet Republics. The agreement means supplies not only from Britain, but probably from America as well via Britain. Perhaps that's why the camera catches a real smile by Stalin.
Stalin's smile would not last long, though, as his son Yakov Djugashvili was captured by the Nazis just 4 days later. He'd been serving on the Soviet front lines during the Battle of Smolensk and had surrendered to the German forces. It was a significant blow to Stalin, who had demanded no surrenders at all, and the Germans quickly took advantage of the situation with propaganda leaflets that encouraged other Soviet citizens to follow his example.
Bringing the propaganda weapon to the front, the Nazis vainly hoped to sap Russian resistance by loudspeaker appeals to surrender. Very few experiments convinced them that the Red Armies scorned to listen. Only through burning towns did the Germans advance. So far, fighting necessarily on the defensive, the Soviet can go back a long way. Russia is a vast country. She can afford to yield more devastated miles, more blown-up bridges than any other country in the world.
The German Army and Air Force generals tasked with the execution of Barbarossa would have drawn strength from the fact that the majority of them had already served in World War I, which is when armies of the Central Powers had defeated Imperial Russia. Something which the Swedes had failed to do at the very peak of their military proficiency. This is something which Napoleon had failed to do. Essentially, the Imperial German Army is the only army to ever inflict a total defeat on Russia in a main theater of operations. On top of which, based on what's been happening in places like Norway and France and the Balkans, the German senior officer corps feels that their army is, if anything, far more formidable than anything they had back in 1914. So what took them 3 years last time around, this time would probably just take them 3 to 4 months.
They were moving about 50 miles a day in some parts, and this went on right from the Baltic all the way down to close to the Black Sea, an enormous 1,000-mile front. It was a stunning success for the invading troops. They were surrounding the Red Army in massive encircling operations, capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. It's generated a sense of euphoria amongst the German army leadership, and in Hitler, of course, too. Hitler at this stage was still regarded by most of the generals, most Germans, as a great military genius as a result of what had happened the previous year. The previous year, he had conquered the old enemy, France, in a plan he'd devised himself after the official army plans had been accidentally betrayed to the West. He was still regarded, I think, as an extraordinary military genius, a natural instinctive genius who'd not been trained like the Prussian generals had, but who broke the rules and broke them successfully. So there's a general sense of elation, euphoria, through June, July 1941.
When the invasion started, many of them were optimistic. One can tell all this from the letters home. Many were optimistic, thinking that it would only take a few weeks. In fact, a lot of their officers had told them, you'll be able to go on leave, by September. Hitler came up with this phrase, you know, kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down. But that was not to be in the end. And even in the first few weeks, they were finding that soldiers were fighting on in small groups when they had expected them all to throw down their arms and surrender.
Some Russians resisted with fanatical determination. They fought literally to the death, and they took an amazing number of Germans with them, just in isolated pockets at first and so on. But some German officers who saw this and saw the ferocity with which, amid all the mass surrenders, some really committed Russians fought, they just had this worm of doubt in their minds, this worm of uncertainty, and they began to think, if more Russians start to fight the way that a few of these guys have done, we're going to have a problem.
These historic pictures are the first record of the Battle of Russia, the defense of 180 million people against Hitler's all-powerful Panzer divisions. The film was made during the first few weeks of the war by Russian army cameramen at the front line.
The largest battle in the history of mankind was unfolding in the summer of 1941. The Soviet Union suffered tremendous losses, but its incredible resilience would eventually prove decisive in the outcome of World War II. With the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the entire landscape of World War II had changed. Germany was fighting on both Western and Eastern fronts, and Britain now had a formidable new ally.
From London, Winston Churchill himself answers the question about Britain. Broadcasting to the world only a few hours after Germany struck, the Prime Minister says,
Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder. So now this bloodthirsty gutter snipe must launch his mechanized armies at the new fields of slaughter, pillage and devastation. Poor as are the Russian peasants, workmen and soldiers, he must steal from them their daily bread.
Hitler's reaction, as well as anybody else's, was enthusiastic. That essentially they felt that they had been vindicated. They felt that essentially the doomsayers, or the handful of critics that had essentially piped up, had been all wrong. And this essentially, by the time you get to mid-July, he is basically telling the Japanese ambassador, listen, we will probably wrap this up in another month, max. And then, of course, you get to the last week of July when Soviet resistance begins to stiffen just outside Smolensk. And they do not exactly inflict a major defeat on the Germans, they just slow them down. They just slow them down, and this initial slowing down process then turns into a month-long stalemate to the east of Smolensk throughout August 1941. And by the very first days of September, both the HQ staff of Army Group Center, as well as Adolf Hitler himself, are actually starting to be seriously concerned.
General Voroshilov, Marshal of the Soviet Army, directs defenses. It is noteworthy that here are shown no great masses of troops, but significantly only small groups. Likewise, the Western armies under General Timoshenko are deployed in great depth with only a few soldiers visible. The pictures of Marshal Boudinny's forces in the southwest reveal still another significant fact, the apparently excellent service of supply behind the Russian artillery, with really modern guns protecting the front.
Right from the start, there were three main axes of attack into the Soviet Union. Hitler had insisted on one of the prongs heading towards Leningrad partly for psychological reasons again, you know, the cradle of Bolshevism, but also he insisted that it was vital to dominate the Baltic for economic reasons, though that wasn't entirely clear. The central one for Army Group Center was to head basically towards Moscow. But Hitler had a curious, superstitious view that he shouldn't exactly follow Napoleon's route, because then the same sort of fate would happen to him. The third one, of course, was the Army Group South, which was going into the Ukraine to establish a control over the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and then head on towards the Caucasus and the oil wells.
The German army's professionals, they were some of the finest professional warriors the world has ever seen, and they were not stupid. And they knew how big Russia was. They knew how limited were the resources of the Wehrmacht, above all their problems with mobility. They were appalled by some of Hitler's decisions. There was almost a contest in incompetence between Hitler and Stalin. Hitler's insistence on dividing forces and in going in 2 or 3 directions at once, whereas always the German army had taken pride in saying you decide where your Schwerpunkt is going to be, where your main axis of attack, and you really go for it. And of course, the professionals that always wanted Moscow to be the Schwerpunkt, you just go for Moscow, and once you've got Moscow, once you've got the north of Russia, then the rest will come gradually. But Hitler wouldn't have that.
The army generals were mostly Prussian aristocrats. They are very traditional. They all look back to Clausewitz, the great military theorist of the Napoleonic Wars. And Clausewitz said, the way you win a war is you locate the main force of the enemy and you engage it in battle and you exterminate it, and bingo, you've got a victory. So that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to go to Moscow, where they saw the main force of the enemy, of the Red Army, and they wanted to do that. Hitler had a broader strategic vision. What Germany lacked was, above all, natural resources, and particularly oil. And so Hitler divided his forces and went for Kiev, went for Ukraine, and then also went for the Caucasus. Now, the generals didn't think this was a very good idea. They still fixated on this idea of annihilating the main enemy force for Moscow. Eventually, the Nazis score a stunning success in Kiev, and they look as if they're doing pretty well there. They're motoring through the Caucasus without encountering very serious opposition. And so the forces are reunited and move towards Moscow. The problem is time has been lost.
The German planned offensive to seize Moscow itself was named Operation Typhoon, which launched on the 2nd of October 1941. Just over a month into the assault, Stalin chose to hold a military parade in Red Square to stiffen Soviet resolve. But it was forces outside his control that proved decisive in the defense of the capital.
Winter comes early. This has always saved Russia. Napoleon didn't believe his weather forecasters. Hitler didn't believe his weather forecasters. And whatever's wrong with Russian machinery, if you've ever had a Russian car, you realize it starts at -30 or even -40, and a German car does not. And the same applies to tanks. And the German machinery could not cope. Hitler had also reckoned on reaching Moscow, rather like Napoleon had reckoned, before things got bad. So there was no winter clothing. In fact, fur coats had to be sent from Germany.
So arrogant were the Nazis and was Hitler and the military leadership, they'd actually said in the autumn, publicly, we've won, we've defeated the Soviets. It's a complete illusion. And the troops didn't have winter clothing. They were simply still dressed in their summer clothing. So Goebbels, realizing that the soldiers were literally freezing to death, organizes a big appeal in Germany itself. Bring us your winter clothing. Let's have your fur coats, please, to support our boys down in Russia. But it's all too late.
I've always argued that the World War II German army was one of the most remarkable fighting machines that the world has ever seen, albeit in a dreadful cause. But the incompetence with which the advance on Moscow was organized, and above all, the absolute lack of preparations for winter, which anybody who knew any history at all, anybody who knew what happened to Napoleon's army in 1812, knew that the Russians, it got pretty cold out there in the winter. And to send these men to attack Russia and to attack Moscow with no winter clothing. And I have met German veterans of that campaign describing to me these dreadful moments when they had to put sheets of newspaper under their tunics because they had no winter coats. They had to light fires under the tanks and vehicles in order to get them started in the morning, that everything was freezing. The guns were freezing, the clothing was freezing, the men were freezing. And the one thing that the Red Army was incredibly well equipped with, not very surprisingly, was winter clothing. So that as winter descended, and by this unbelievable series of blunders and errors, that the Germans had made no preparations for this, that when the winter came, and these first terrible freezes, that they got one of the most devastating shocks of the war. But of course it shouldn't have been a shock.
Despite the terrible conditions, German armed forces still attempted to encircle Moscow in a pincer movement, where the two invading forces planned to unite in the city of Noginsk.
If you capture Moscow, you capture the capital, and if you do it efficiently by doing a pincer movement around it, you capture all the leaders. And in theory, if you capture the leaders and, as Hitler planned to, hang them publicly in Red Square, then the whole fabric collapses. And it would have worked possibly if Hitler had got there in time, or if autumn had been warmer and winter hadn't come so soon.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that essentially even soldiers who had been in combat from day one were ready to give it one last go, to essentially, you could say, go for a high-risk late autumn offensive in order to grab Moscow and finish the war. There's even a staff officer in the HQ of 4th Army who basically is, that's the bizarre thing, he's a committed anti-Nazi. I mean, he writes things in the letters to his family which would have at the very least have gotten him sacked from the army, and probably worse. And he's basically saying, we need to give it a go. We're this close. We can't drop it. This is the do or die moment. And this is somebody who's not sold on the idea of Lebensraum or anything of the kind. So there's this feeling of, my God, we are this close, and yes, winter's closing in and we may only have 16 days or so, but we need to make it count. And that's what keeps many of them going. Then, of course, you get to December 5th, which by coincidence is the day when the offensive ends, and the temperature drops. Literally goes from -15, which for much of the time is still barely tolerable, to -13 places.
But there's another factor that Hitler hoped that his ally Japan would move in from the other end, cross Siberia, and they could then meet in the Urals and finish the job. But Stalin learnt from his spy in Tokyo that the Japanese had no plans to invade Russia. They were so busy holding on to China and mopping up the remnants of the British, the French and the Dutch Empire around the Pacific that they had no interest in invading Siberia. What would they want Siberia for when the rich pickings of tropical countries like Vietnam and Burma? So this is what in fact saved Stalin, that he found out from his spies that it was safe to move his Siberian troops to Moscow. And these were the only Russian troops that had enjoyed a victory. In 1938, they'd fought the Japanese in Manchuria and they'd won the battle. And they came properly equipped for Siberia. And when they appeared in Moscow, then the Germans realized that they would never get to the center of the city. They got to the outskirts. They got to even the tram terminus on the western outskirts, but they could get no further.
Berlin predicted when these Nazi films were being made that Russia would be blitzed in a few weeks. Today, American news agencies report Russia is strongly counterattacking and that less than 1/50th of Russia's vast area has been invaded. These pictures show then the beginning of the blitz that turned into a siege.
The successful defense of Moscow was a huge symbolic victory for the Soviet Union. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began, the German forces were not only being resisted, they were being driven back. In December 1941, the German army's plan to capture Moscow in Operation Typhoon failed on the outskirts of the city.
German troops have to try and make dugouts and trenches and so on, but you've got deep frozen ground. It's really very difficult. The supply situation is okay. They're not starving, but they're not really able to withstand this terrible freezing cold. And all the letters home all complain about this. And there are stories of how, soldiers are on guard duty at night simply are found in the morning standing dead, stiff, frozen to death, literally frozen to death. It's hard to exaggerate the depth and seriousness and power of the Russian winter. And in this context, of course, everybody starts thinking of Napoleon. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 met with similar circumstances, met with deep cold. He met with Russian troops making attacks on all sides. And everybody says this is Hitler's 1812. This is just like Napoleon, ironically, because, of course, just the previous year, he'd made a special visit to Paris after the fall of France to pay his respects to the tomb of Napoleon. I think feeling I've actually done better than him, and now here he was suffering the same fate. Napoleon said, I've not been defeated by the Russian generals, I've been defeated by General Winter.
You could say, a German attempt starting in mid-November 1941 to get to Moscow, which basically dies a slow death, a gradual death, around December 3rd, 4th and 5th. And then you could say the operation ends and they're left more or less frozen in place. Close to Moscow, but not close enough. And then you've got the second phase of the Battle of Moscow, which is the Russian counterattack.
I would stake a claim that the Russian counterattacks around Moscow were among the decisive moments of the Second World War. Maybe more so than Stalingrad, which happens more than a year later, maybe more so than Kursk 2 years later, because this was the moment at which the Germans not only find themselves failing to take Moscow, but they find themselves being driven back from Moscow. Now, again and again, tactically, German units would win little victories, they'd win little successes, they'd inflict devastating casualties on the advancing Russians. But the one thing the Russians had enormous quantities of was people. And Stalin was completely indifferent, as were his generals, to how many of them he lost. And although he was a disastrous warlord, a disastrous director of operations in that first year of the war, until he reluctantly handed it over to his marshals, that he gave his commanders around Moscow just sufficient leeway for them to be able to exercise their terrific skills to organize these counterattacks.
This is where Stalin was cleverer than Hitler. Hitler never understood that he was not a military genius, that he should stand back and let his generals take the decision. Stalin knew from the start he was not a military genius. He'd proved that in the Civil War in the 1920s, when he made some terrible mistakes. And after the defense of Moscow, he stood back and he let his generals decide what to do. He withdrew all the party officials who were constantly monitoring generals and censoring them and forbidding them to do what they wanted to do. And he gave people like Zhukov and Konev full scope to do really what they wanted. And he even took advice from them and didn't object. He stopped arresting generals. That was the cleverest thing that Stalin did, was to leave the job to professionals. And that, of course, is where Hitler made some very, very serious mistakes.
Out there, Russian counterattackers sight the remnants of a German invading force. The city is strategic Tula, just below Moscow. And these are first pictures of Russia's amazing drive. The heroic defense of Tula helped destroy the Nazi pincers around Moscow. And here's how it happened. Town after town is recaptured in this fashion. These are actual battle pictures made under fire. evidence of blitzkrieg that failed. In Tula, in Mozhaisk, and along a 1,700-mile front, Nazi dead testify to the bogging down of Germany's march. How Mr. Hitler can explain this failure is a mystery, but no mystery is the fighting determination of the tireless Russians.
Hitler always distrusted the generals, especially any of those who he thought were sort of high-born. He had a tremendous chip on his shoulder, inevitably, in that particular way, especially as he probably knew that people like Rundstedt referred to him as that bohemian corporal and things like that. He was determined to prove them wrong. He much preferred to sack them and then take over control. I mean, he was a micromanager. At times, he was even looking at small-scale maps, dictating where even companies, let alone battalions, should be positioned, and basically getting the orders sort of passed on down the line. So this sort of obsessive micromanaging became thoroughly disastrous. He would not give the generals their head, and in this particular case, after Moscow, he was determined to make sure that none of them were going to have the independence that they would like to have in deciding whether to withdraw or not.
Hitler moved southeast. He ignored, after failing to get Moscow, he didn't try again. He didn't even make Napoleon's mistake of considering going north to Leningrad. He let Leningrad go on being besieged and starved to death. It had no military importance anyway. What he decided he badly needed was the oil fields at Baku on the Caspian Sea. So that change meant heading for the Volga and heading for a city that used to be called the Tsar's city, Tsaritsyn, which Stalin had renamed after himself, Stalingrad.
Hitler's planned offensive in southern Russia was named Case Blue, and it would begin just a year after the start of Operation Barbarossa. The Germans' attempt to cross the Volga River and the legendary Battle of Stalingrad that ensued would be seen by many as the most decisive turning point of World War II.
One of the oddest things about the Second World War is that in Berlin, the clever staff officers and the clever officials around Hitler were much quicker to see how much trouble they were in Russia than anybody was in the West. That well into 1942, in fact even up to the autumn of 1942, all the smart money in London and in Washington, and the British generals, the American generals, they still thought the Russians were going to lose. They still thought that as the Germans kept delivering punch after punch and these huge offensives, taking great swathes of territory, and they thought, well, thank goodness, the Russians have lasted a bit longer than we thought. But the archives are stuffed with British and American reports as late as August and September 1942 saying, we think these guys are still going to lose. But in Berlin, they weren't thinking like that. In Berlin, from the beginning of 1942 onwards, they had this cold feeling, the smart people in Berlin, that having failed to make that decisive victory, having inflicted this horror story on the German army in the winter of 1941-42, they realized they were in big, big trouble.
In Part 2, we cover how Hitler's obsession with conquering the Soviet Union led to the most devastating German defeats, both at the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk. Having survived a relentless onslaught, the Soviet Union would eventually drive the invading forces out of their territory and all the way back to the streets of Berlin, where Hitler's obsession finally died in the Führer bunker.